Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out to the panel today on Memoir Comics. We're really excited to have you here and so thankful for all of our panelists who are coming out today. Will Eisner wrote some amazing memoir comics, and as a celebration of Will Eisner Week, we would be remiss to ignore that fact. And today we have some amazing comics creators here who've created memoir comics, and if everyone would like to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Henry Barajas. I'm the author of Voz De M.A.Y.O, Tata Rambo. It's about my great-grandfather, Ramon Jauregue, who was a World War II veteran and an orphan that helped one of the last Native American tribes gain federal recognition and keep their land from being bulldozed by the city of Tucson to make way for the Interstate 10. And it's also about my life of trying to figure out what he did and his impact and his imperfections. And it was made possible through crowdfunding. So some people here, thank you so much for helping me. And that's me in a nutshell.
Hi, my name is Cecil Castellucci. The memoir that I wrote is called Girl on Film, and it's about me growing up in New York City in the 80s, in New York that doesn't exist anymore, going to the High School of Performing Arts, the Fame School, for those of you that know that movie, and intersecting with a lot of people that became part of pop culture, and me wanting to be and thinking I was going to become the world's greatest filmmaker that ever existed and completely failing at that. But sort of journeying into art and how art takes us to where we want to go. You know, as we go on our journey, it sort of nudges us in a direction if we choose to hear the call, or if we are, if it works out for us to hear the call. But the other thing is, as I was writing the memoir, I realized I was not remembering things and not telling stories quite the same way that they actually were when I looked back at my journals or talked with my friends. My dad is a world-renowned neurobiologist, and his specialty is the mechanics of memory, how we store long and short-term memories. So part of the memoir is a conversation about neuroscience and about memory with my father.
Wow. Okay, I'm Mary Fleener. I live in Encinitas, and I started doing comics in 1984. And I had a solo title called Slutburger, which was autobiographical comics from a woman's point of view. And I compiled that into a book called Life of the Party. And then I went through many, many years of not really doing that. And a couple of years ago, I decided to do a young adult novel about bees. And then my publisher, Gary Groth at Fantagraphics, said, please, would you do an autobiographical book? I know you got another one in you. So I'm working on my days of playing in a bar band in the 70s, pre-AIDS, pre-internet, and it's called The Happy Hour, and I'm dealing with exactly what she was talking about, the selective memories that I had, and then talking to people that played with me at that time who completely don't remember things I remember, and I remember, same thing. So I'm working on that book. Probably take me 2 years to do it, but in 2022, I'll be there. Okay. Oh, you guys can share that.
Yeah, we have a shared one. Hi, I'm going to move this just for now. I'm Kate Leth. I make comics on the internet. I started in 2011 doing Autobiographical Comics on Tumblr with all of everything that goes along with. And then sort of moved more into mainstream comics for a while, did some stuff, with IDW, Boom, Marvel, things like that, then got into animation. And then a year and a half ago, after suddenly not having a day job, got back into doing autobio comics. And so now I do one called Ghouls that is on Instagram and Webtoon and all kinds of different places. And it's sort of a slice of life, daily, furry light comic about love and queer issues and mental health and things like that. So that's me, yeah. Sorry.
No, it was right. Hi, my name is Victoria Ying, and I wrote this short autobiographical comic called My Mother Tongue. It's about me and my relationship to the Chinese language, being an immigrant, a child of immigrants, and dealing with trying to assimilate, but at the same time trying to deal with both those identities. I'm a comic book artist, and I do recently Wonder Woman, Diana, Princess of the Amazons just released. And I have my own solo authored project called City of Secrets, which is coming out in July. And then I'm working on another semi-autobiographical comic called Hungry Ghost, which is about being Chinese American and dealing with an eating disorder. So memoir is very close to me, and I'd love to keep doing more of it.
I think memoir comics are so important because they tell stories that everybody can relate to. It's just kind of a question for everybody. So what made you want to write a memoir comic, and kind of how did you get started?
I'll start up here, I guess. My growing up, you don't really hear about a lot of Mexican American icons, or unless they're like Cesar Chavez, and then you find out about Dolores Huerta after the fact. And my great grandfather was on his deathbed in the VA, and he survived. And I was like, well, it's time we put your story down. And I read March by John Lewis and everyone that was involved with that. And I decided that, oh, well, I've been trying to get into comics this whole time, but haven't had any luck. So maybe I should go this route. And it was also just like, became kind of a self-discovery of finding myself more comfortable with being a Mexican American, and being that I can't speak Spanish, but I understand it. And I'm never Mexican enough for my family, but I'm never white enough for the industry that I want to be in. So it was just a whole, 5-year process of trying to figure myself out, but also trying to put down my great-grandfather's life in as many pages as possible while self-publishing it. So yeah, it was an incredible journey, and it's one of the best things I've ever done, and I'm super proud of it.
I hadn't really thought about doing a memoir. I write superheroes. I write Batgirl right now, and I've done a lot of young adult graphic novels that I've written. And I had done a historical fiction about a hobo, a young adult. It's called Soupy Leaves Home. And the editor, Sierra Hahn, she was at Dark Horse, now she's at Boom, she took me out to lunch, and she said, would you want to write a memoir about being in a Riot Girl band when, in the 90s in Canada? And, Riot Girl wasn't really in Canada in the 90s. We'd heard about it, but it wasn't really there.
Everything we get
yeah,
sort of light.
Light, yeah, exactly. So, but I was in one of the very few all-girl bands in the early 90s in Canada, and so she had asked me if I wanted to write about that, and I was like, no, I don't really want to write about that, because I feel like, it would be better to have a book like that was from someone in Washington, maybe Olympia at the time. And also, if I was going to do something like that, I would want to be, I would want to make it fiction, like a fictional YA thing. But I said I would be interested in writing about trying so hard to become an artist and failing, because I feel like that's something that probably we all have done, where you just try so hard, and no matter what, like, you just feel like it's carrying you along. And I started telling her all these stories about my childhood. My godfather was a famous ballet dancer, so when I would go to the ballet, I would watch In the Wings, or my best friend was Jennifer Aniston, and just like all these crazy, I met Andy Warhol in my youth, and so those sort of anecdotes kind of led, like, I was interested in writing about that. And then of course I thought it was a holy mess, because I was like, who cares? Really, I care about this like at a cocktail party, but like, so when I really stumbled upon starting to have these serious because I said I was going to give the money back. And but when I started having these conversations with my dad, then it became sort of more this sort of journey into memory, and that sort of became this compelling thing about, sort of art and memory, and how that's what spurs us on. Even if we're doing fiction work, even if we're doing superhero work, a lot of times memory is the seed of a lot of things that sort of empower us.
Okay. Yeah. Well, my favorite part of the library has always been autobiographical books and biographies. But I always thought you had to be very famous to do a book like that. So I started, somebody turned me on to Zora Neale Hurston in the early 80s, and I realized you could write about people that were nobodies and poor and living out in the middle of nowhere and make it fascinating. And Zora Neale Hurston kind of inspired me to maybe I could do that too, because I'm a freak magnet, basically. I've always met weird people. Even when I was a little kid, people would come up to me and start talking to me on the street, and my mom would be going, "Don't talk to them." And I just have this unflinching gaze. So with this new book I'm doing, I am writing about being in a rock band, but no one in there, except for one guy, the drummer, is famous. They're people who just did this little time in life. And I remember when I was playing in this bar, every night after a gig, I go, "Someday I'm gonna write a book." And I covered a little bit of this in my book, Life of the Party. But with this new one I'm working on, I wanted to tell a common story uncommonly well. That's about it.
Yeah, nice. Okay, I guess we're going down the line. For me, I guess it was like I've always liked that kind of thing, and much like many baby gays, I was very into Alison Bechdel when I was in college. But in reading that and reading Fun Home, it was like she was so fastidious about making sure that everything that happened was like exactly right, and had this sort of photographic memory of events. And I always thought, like, oh my God, I have ADD so bad, I'd never do that. And then I started working at a comic book store, and my boss was like, "Oh, well, if you like that kind of stuff, why don't you try like Chester Brown and all those kinds of things?" And I was like, "Well, this is kind of cool, but like none of these are by women." And then sort of the era of live journal autobio comics started happening, and I found Kate Beaton and Jess Fink. And I was already a person who really liked webcomics. But once I got into those, I was like, oh my God, like, you know, these people didn't go to school to make autobio comics specifically, and they're not like, I don't know, it was just so incredible to finally see people who I could relate to and I could look at and think, well, I want to make work like that. And it does exist. I don't feel so alienated. So I started doing that kind of thing and have sort of figured it out over the last 9 years, I guess. But yeah, that was a big thing for me, was seeing like other women who hadn't been in comics for 30 years or whatever. They were just kind of like, I'm gonna try. Like Kate Beaton had no formal training. She was from the same province that I'm from. And so it very much felt like, oh, I can do this. So yeah, that's how I ended up in it.
For me, doing autobiographical comics, actually it was my very first comic ever, is this one right here. And I made it because there's a frame story in it about a trip to China. And my boyfriend was telling me, he's like, oh, I'm surprised you can't speak better Chinese, because, you know, it'd be so cool if I could learn a different language. And so for me, I was like, why is that the case? Why is it the case that I don't speak better Chinese? And I had to reflect on that, and then I wrote this because it was almost like me explaining to other people and also to myself, like, why I have this very complicated relationship with my second language. And then my new book, Hungry Ghost, about having an eating disorder, I pretty much wrote that for my mom because she just does not understand and refuses to like read or learn anything about it. Pretty much she's just like, that didn't happen, and that's not real. So I was like, no, it was real. Let me show you exactly how real it was. So for me, all the autobiographical comics that I've done have really been almost specifically speaking to one person and trying to communicate a complicated idea to them.
I feel like a common theme throughout all the answers is that even though Memoir comic is about you, it's not just about you. It's about your friends and your partners and your family. Do you feel like a responsibility to check with them before you write something, or do you go back and ask them? Or how involved are the other people in the comics with your creative process?
I can speak to this. So I'm working on a graphic novel right now, or starting to at some point, that is semi-autobiographical, but has that sort of veneer of fiction that, you know, protects the guilty and innocent. But my mom is a big part of it, and my mom is very touchy about the way I depict her in comics, because we come from a small town in Canada, and a lot of people she knows read my comics. So, like, I've done stuff before where I've posted something and alluded, because my stuff's really personal. I talk a lot about body image and mental health and sexuality and stuff like that, with really cute little pictures, which tricks people into learning things and having empathy. This is my goal. But I made like a reference to because I quit drinking a year and a half ago, and, you know, references to being around people who struggled with alcoholism. And I went home to visit my mom, and she's like, everyone thinks I'm an alcoholic now. And I was like, no, that's not a thing. Anyway, so I have sort of that opposite thing, because I have seen, you know, Alison Bechdel and people like that say, you don't really have an obligation to anyone. If it happened, it's fair game. And I don't feel that way at all. I feel like there are consequences, there are real world repercussions to stuff like that. And I totally understand people's different views of it. But for me, there's definitely, I think about all the time, like, you know, I don't want to make this person, if they were a good person, look terrible, things like that. But if someone was genuinely terrible, then I might, you know, change the way they look and depict the way they really were.
Yeah, my rule of thumb was do no harm. Like, do no harm to anybody in my life, and do no harm to myself. And, you know, tell the truth, but, you know, in a kind way. And I think that was sort of helpful. I mean, I think it also helped that I had my dad in my book explaining how memory is unreliable. So I kind of was like, I don't need to ask anybody about anything, because my dad said, here's the brain science, you know. But I think that is part of the thing, right? It's like what you were saying, Mary, about how, you know, other people remember things differently than you do, or they don't remember at all. And I just love this idea that we're all each other's memory keepers, you know. And so I didn't ask anybody for anything except to ask what their, you know, understanding of a certain situation was.
Yeah, for me, I also, like, obviously, the book about my eating disorder has a lot to do with my mother and our relationship. And part of the reason why it's semi-autobiographical is, so I can hide behind the fact that these characters are not me, this is not exactly our story, but also it allowed me to use a more traditional storytelling structure. So I drew a lot on my life and a lot of very real conversations. There's a few in there that are verbatim, but I definitely am trying to give my mother plausible deniability. So by making it like, okay, this is semi-autobiographical. It's based on some experiences I had, but at the same time, it's not exactly these people. It's not exactly the relationship that we have now. And it's interesting because Memoir, the way that it is, it's so static. Like, my relationship with my mother has changed a lot in the past year. And that story is going to kind of remain what it is in the reader's mind. But I think that, like, those feelings and that story is still very authentic to where I was at that time. So I still stand by that work, but there's definitely like some touchiness with trying to be sensitive to your subjects and trying to make sure that you're not just being unfair to them.
Yeah, I was a journalist while I was making comics, so I had a commitment to the truth, and my great-grandfather did amazing things, and I had some friends help me kind of do a background check, and he had gotten arrested for something, and I realized that if I were to publish something about him, information would come out, and I wanted to address his infidelity, because whenever I learn about someone that I really respect, like Martin Luther King, I had no idea he had cheated on his wife while he was doing amazing things, and I felt kind of tricked, and I wanted, especially in this climate of men never being held accountable for the bad things that they do, I wanted to address that in a way that was honest, but also how you could see both sides of where someone is coming from and how they feel respected in public, but their family resented him at home, so he was never home. And my family was worried about that because they knew my life as a journalist, and they knew what I was going to do in comics, but they didn't really care about comics, and they didn't understand what I was trying to do, so they just kind of spilled their guts. And then it made it on the page, and they still haven't read it, but they saw it in the newspaper, so they're super happy about it.
Kate and Victoria, you both mentioned body image, and I think one thing that's interesting in Memoir comics is that, you know, 3 of you, you know, draw yourselves, and 2 of you did not. And how does that process for all of you, like, you know, the way that you view yourself versus the way others see you, and is there, you know, sort of either a vanity or a self-loathing ascribed to that?
Oh my God, yeah, that's such a complicated question. My next autobiographical comic is going to be literally about body image and what that's like as an artist, because you grow up with these images of comic book heroes and like what they look like, and especially for my history, like, and I had some pretty severe body dysmorphia, like trying to just accept that like my body is not exactly like the ideal, and also having that responsibility to be like, okay, well, I need to start representing more of these bodies, because that's the work that I do. Like, I get to produce those images and put that out into the world. So yeah, no, I think it's really important, and something that is still difficult for me, because I do still have some body dysmorphia, and I'm always like, am I drawing myself exactly fat enough? like, is this accurate? Or am I being either way? Like, I'm like, am I being too flattering, or am I being too hard on myself? And you just don't know what that is. And yeah, it's a lifelong struggle.
Yeah, I've lost sleep over exactly that. Yeah. There's a reason why Valley Ghouls is extremely simplistic little monsters and animals. Because I like drawing autobio comics, but it was like, my tattoos are a pain in the ass to draw. But if I don't draw them, I feel like it looks like a different kind of person. I feel like me having I have tattoos a lot, and not drawing them it's a different kind of person, you know? And I used to draw myself and stuff, and I had that exact same problem of am I drawing myself the weight that I am? Am I being too flattering? Am I not being flattering enough? And I struggled with that so much, about drawing myself exactly mediocre enough in an insane way that no one else would care about. So that was why when I, really committed to the comic that I do now, I was like, I just don't want it to be me. I don't want to have to worry about me drawing myself. It's got my hair and my glasses, but it's a little bat, and everyone else in it is a little creature, and I don't have to worry about someone being like, oh, you drew me fat or whatever, and so in my world, it's like everyone looks the way they would want to look if they were a little creature. And I've asked people, what animal do you want to be, kind of thing, and that helps a lot. And so when I'm working on this upcoming project, the fact that that's autobio, it's I have to draw myself as a teen, and oh God, because I wasn't skinny and I wasn't really overweight, but I their body image, and writing that line is a huge part of that age for me. So it's I don't have a really good answer other than that it's terrifying.
Well, you know that phrase, you can get away with murder in comics? That's what I do. And if I want to draw myself size 6, I do. But I really do think that, you look at yourself in the mirror all the time, every day, several times a day, 100 times a day, and I think you unconsciously really do draw yourself in people's faces. And so I kind of just rely on that, and I do what you do, the hair and maybe the striped T-shirt, and then after that, who cares? But it just, why struggle with that? I mean, but, if you're talking about body issues and stuff, but the book Drawing Power that I was just in about the Me Too movement, that was one where I had to be brutally honest about a lot of stuff, and change the names. I didn't answer in the last cycle, so I'm throwing that in now. I used to change the appearances, change the names. With the new book, I'm not going to do that so much, but change the names. So, two answers in one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a writer. I don't draw, so I'm going to give a shout out to the 4 artists that worked on Girl on Film: John Berg, Vicky Lida, Melissa Duffy, and V. Gagnon. And so, because the book takes place over 3 different time periods, sort of my early childhood, middle school, and high school, college, Sierra, and also this conversation with my dad, Sierra had this idea to get 4 different artists to sort of draw the different times, because as we sort of grow older, our relationship with our own memories change, and our relationship with ourselves and how we see ourselves change. And so that was one sort of strategy that we used, and that was really cool. But it was really hard for me to look at the drawings sometimes, because I'd be like, that's not what I look like, or is that what I look like, or whatever. And normally when I write a comic book, I'm very, very close collaborators with the artists that I work with. We're texting all the time, and, love letters, and this. And this one, I felt a real sense. I did communicate with them, but I did a lot of more communicating through my editor, because I couldn't trust myself to not be like, oh, well, no, that's not exactly right. And I didn't want the artists to feel as though they weren't sort of doing justice to the story, because I think that's one of the things that you have to do as a writer anyways when you're working with an artist, is to have that great collaboration, is you must let go your ideas about what it looks like. Otherwise, I mean, that's not comics. I mean, comics is about that collaboration. But when it's really personal, like I felt like, oh dear, So I was so glad. Thank you, editors, for for being there to give a little bit of psychic distance. But sort of once I sort of got on board with the way that each of them was sort of seeing me, and I gave them a lot of reference. Like it was interesting to look harshly at myself and be like, oh yeah, I am that ugly sometimes or whatever, And I don't mean ugly in my face. I mean ugly in my, what I did or what happened or whatever. And that was really a great thing, to be able to sort of accept.
With my book, the amazing Jay Gonzo did the everything. He drew the whole pencils, inks, colors, and my notes were always. I never really asked him to draw me in a certain way. He did want to give me a mustache that I sometimes have, but it was important for me to have. There's not a lot of comics out there right now or in the last couple of years of Native Americans. So we wanted Native Americans of all sizes and shapes and genders and Mexican Americans. So when you open up the page, you see everybody and of all shapes and sizes. And since the historical figures and pictures that we only had like side views. So I gave Gonzo complete autonomy to draw however he wanted to. And it was beautiful to like be a part of something that showcases people that look like me in my neighborhood and people I grew up with. In kind of who they are. It's not a superhero book, so they don't have to have abs. And it was a very beautiful experience.
So I think there's like the aesthetic side of it, but then also, has there ever been a time where you wanted to change an incident in the way that you write it because you didn't like how, you wanted to frame it a little bit differently, or you wanted to either defend your actions or the actions of someone else? Like, well, maybe it didn't really happen like that. Have you ever just wanted to shift it a little bit?
Yeah.
You bet.
You want to, but sometimes you fight the urge, I guess. I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
Well, this new book I'm doing, the whole world's going to know what a slut I was, and I don't care anymore. So, but thanks to being in Drawing Power, that released my inhibitions, because I had to write about being dosed and raped. So once you can do that, you can only go up.
Yeah, I mean, just to speak to that, like, I wrote about a sexual assault that happened in the book, and I didn't want, it was the hardest thing that I wrote, and I didn't like writing it, and I had to, like, put my head down on my desk and sob, and I was like, oh, this, writing is, well, sometimes it's not fun because it's so hard, but, like, I was like, this is bad. Like, I don't want to do this, but I didn't want to not do it. And because I felt, but it's only as much of the truth as I can sort of remember, right? There's an incident, there's a scene in the book as though it didn't happen. I was in a bombing when I was younger, an IRA bombing. And I remember certain things about it. My dad was there too. And so one of the things that we do in the book is we have this conversation, which we had never had before, about what he remembers from that day and that moment, and from what I remember from that day and what from that moment. And it's very, very different. And together we kind of reconstructed the memory. So I kind of thought of like trying to put down as much truth as I could to help to reconstruct the memory with whoever may pick up the book, who may have known me or doesn't know me, but that they fill in the other part.
That was such an interesting passage because of when you talked with your father, it was like what was important to you versus what was important to him, like about the soda. Like,
yeah.
There was no way that would have been important to your father, but like
no,
soda as a kid
7
is
Up,
a big,
are you kidding me? I
is
was
a big
allowed.
deal.
Yeah. And he was like, what are you talking about? Yeah.
So what, through these memoir comics, what do you hope to give to others? What's the goal in doing them, or were they just kind of for yourselves?
I think it really depends on the kind of project, because some people do a lot of like, the same vein of work, and then I think that usually has like a unifying theme to it, but I do a lot of different kinds of stuff. You know, I do stuff like with the daily comics that I do are pretty lighthearted, like even if they're touching on pretty real stuff. They're short, they're only 4 panels, they kind of hit like that. But then, you know, the book that I'm working on, or the pitch that I'm working on, is like I have a thing I'm trying to do with it, which is it's a book about, I'm really trying to pitch it to a preteen audience, a tween audience, because what it's about is about recognizing grooming behaviors in adults, people who prey on younger girls with really low self-esteem, which I'm sure no one here has ever experienced. And so trying to do with that book, starting a character who ends up being very predatory, starting them as a sympathetic character, and then throughout the book revealing that, you know, they're actually really terrible. And so that one has a specific message. Like, that's the thing I'm trying to get across, is to have the reader kind of get sucked into, like, you know, you want to feel special. It's that thing when you're so many girls growing up, and it happens to everyone, but, you know, girls a lot, very much when you are singled out by an adult who's like, you have so much potential, you're so special, you're not like the other girls, and you're like, oh my God, an adult thinks I'm cool, but then it's actually really terrible. So that one specifically, I very much have a message, and then, but like with everything else I do, the only thing I'm really trying to do is have people feel seen, like have people look at a comic and go, oh my God, that's me, oh my God, my boyfriend does that, like, that's so different. That's so much more to, like, I'm just trying to make people happy. And then the other one's like, I need you to feel. So, yeah.
I guess for me, like, mine, they were always, like, for somebody. It was always trying to explain something. So, like, my graphic novel, Hungry Ghost, is going to be about eating disorders, but trying to explain, like, the difficulty that I went through, and partly for someone else, but also partly for me. Like, it was very therapeutic to be able to kind of break down what had happened and almost like dissect that part of my life. So it's both for people who are in that same position, because I feel like when we see people with eating disorders and the parents find out, they're always like, oh my God, and then they rush to help their child, and it's like, well, that doesn't always happen. And it made me feel very lonely when I revealed that I had an eating disorder, and my mother just rejected that out of hand. So I felt like there's definitely other people who are going through that, and I want to make them feel like you're not alone, this isn't that weird, and trying to almost like explain like the cultural significance about why those things are happening.
All right, I'll go. Well, the book I'm working on right now, even though it is a bar band memoir, it took place in Garden Grove Boulevard in Orange County, and I was playing at a dyke bar called the Happy Hour. But it was, in those days, it was all shapes and sizes, as he says. And I want to tell the younger people that there was a time that you could get killed for being gay or transgendered. If you walk down the street, somebody might throw a beer bottle at your head. And I felt that way then, and I felt now that I was in 75 and 76. It was right on the cusp of so much changing. I read about punk rock for the first time in 1975 in this little zine. There'd be little piles of zines at the bars. And at that time in Orange County, there were actually more gay bars down there than there were in Hollywood. And so I played a ton of them in drag bars. I'd never been in, drag bars before. So I just figured if it takes this straight woman to tell the story of what it was like back then I want to do it, because for a year and a half I played every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at this bar with people that didn't fit in society. And there were a couple of times where we would be on stage and the police would come in full riot gear looking for somebody to rape or beat up, and they didn't know if I was gay or straight, and they didn't care. And I just had to play it, take it. And then I started understanding what, it's like, because, you're in a bar, you're one of them, But there was things that probably weren't very popular to talk about, but there was ageism, and there was a lot of the women that I played with in the band hated the drag queens. There was a real prejudice, and I want to relate all this in a sensitive way so people understand that people have good sides and bad sides. So if I can do this in a fair way, that's kind of my goal, is to show the kids that are now transgendered and binary and all this, that they're really lucky to be alive right now.
you know, my book is about not becoming the artist that you think you're going to become. And I think a lot of young people, you know, sort of feel like if I don't succeed at this one thing that I set out to do, then I'm a failure. And I know that I've struggled with my own sense of what is success and what is not success, you know, in arts and in my career, you know, and stuff like that. And so I hope that it's for young people, for teens, I hope it's a book about sort of like finding your path and being okay with where your path takes you, like allowing that. And for I guess grown-ups, I hope that it sort of like reminds you of the artist that you were, and sort of brings that back up for you to be able to, like, you know, reconnect with your inner child dreams.
I started writing this book or graphic novel in 2015, just as the Trump campaign started, and it was and this also in the same time as the Dakota Access Pipeline, and it felt like I had to, and for myself, show a win. You know, we see Mexican Americans and Native Americans working together to stop government from taking their land and their identity, but also show that, you know, with Ramon, he's just one of many voices that there's no way to prove what they did. And it was disturbing to me that even my own people, through the Bascoyaki tribe, I couldn't find any recognition there. So it was important for me to show that we have done stuff, and that when you see the news or when you see things happening now, and it's also, they just look like victims. They're face down in ditches. They're raping and killing and stealing jobs, and they're in cages. But we've done beautiful and amazing things, and it was important for me to highlight that.
Mary, you said once that you credit women with giving the legitimacy to the genre of autobiographical comics. And I think that's because those comics are relatable to everyone, and kind of like also what Henry touched on. Comics is like a medium that's more accessible for people to create and to get out there. So do you think that's something that we still strive for, and you think that's definitely true?
Well, because of the nature of the anthologies that were so common in the 90s, they had women's comics, and then Tits and Clits, and then Twisted Sisters, which really, most of that was autobiographical, and thanks to the work of Diane Newman and Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, it was, you know, stories that had sex, you know, drugs and rock and roll in them, but from a woman's point of view. And I think that made people relate to the stories much more than just some guy that, you know, I went to a strip bar last night, we got all drunk and ha ha ha. Well, that kind of limited genre right there. And I think like the works of you know, Allison, and it took it to, you know, everybody knows Justin Green and Crumb pretty much kind of got the ball rolling. But I think the women kind of just took it to another level where it was more palatable to more people, and it had more of a common everyman theme.
So a couple of you mentioned Alison Bechdel. Was that Almost for Everyone? Is that the comic that made you want to do a memoir? Or what? Is there a memoir comic that you always recommend to people, apart from your own?
Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz.
Yeah, Howard Cruz.
You will cry every time you read that at the end.
That was one that was really funny, because when my boss at the comic book store was recommending comics to me and kept recommending comics by like straight white guys for their autobio, and I was like, man, these guys are really sad they can't get a girlfriend. Do they do anything else?
That's what I mean.
And then like started digging around in sort of the back bins of our store of stuff that had been around since it opened, and found like Ariel Schrag, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, and Schrag and Howard Cruz and that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, this is so much cooler. These people have like much more experience and much more interestingly lived lives. And that was the thing that really got me to be like, oh, it doesn't have to be just this one thing. It doesn't have to be this sort of shoegazy introspective guy thing. It can be anything. It can, and then like when I got into webcomics and when I started finding autobio comics, and you know, if you start reading a couple people, they recommend other people, and especially now with Twitter and social media. And for me now, it's just like there's there's so much that I love. There's so much, and that is, you know, as much as the internet is a hell, that is a side of it that has really encouraged me and continues to, because there's no barrier to entry that way. The same as zine culture. It was like anybody can make them and anybody can get it out there, and I think that's very cool.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I always tell people read March, because we always see we always see Martin Luther King, and it's a beautiful, amazing story and a very tragic story. But we also see the product of that, and seeing that there was more than one person in that era, in that movement. And I think that, like, you know, changed everything for graphic novels and Black history and American history.
I was gonna say Persepolis too. I was given that to read in high school, and that was a big one.
Oh, Special Exits by Joyce Farmer. That's about her taking care of her aged parents. And it's got a great beginning, middle, and end.
I feel
And
like
yeah, Diary of a Teenage
I feel like
Girl.
there are so many, and there are so many, especially right now. We're kind of like in a golden age of young adult, middle grade, slice of life, you know, sort of memoir comics. But I was trying to think about, like, you know, what were the first ones that I felt were like sort of slice of life, not necessarily exactly memoir, but kind of memoir-y, where I was really lucky to be there in Montreal when Drawn and Quarterly was being started. And there were a lot of bande dessinée en direct, you know, live comic jams and stuff. And so, like, just at the very beginning of, even before I even thought about doing comics, it was like reading Roberta Gregory, her Naughty Bits book, and Julie Doucette, you know, and those to me, you know, they felt more true than maybe like March. I mean, March feels really true, but you know, they really spoke to me in that sort of feminist kind of way.
Yeah, and I also was inspired by Harvey Pekar, and being able to, because, you know, in this book there's a lot of talking heads, and I figured I don't have to be that exciting with this, but also just give people a bit of a layer. And yeah, I wanted to be a poor man's Harvey Pekar. Even poorer, actually.
One of my first graphic memoirs that I read were, I think it's a graphic memoir, Blankets. And even though, like, now I look back on it with a slightly different lens, at the time it still really encapsulated that feeling of your first love as a teenager. And I felt like I'd never seen that illustrated as well in any other comics medium, like just describing that feeling. And that's something that really stuck with me. And other graphic memoirs that I think are really cool are like some of the, my lesbian experience with loneliness, which is a pretty like recent series, but still like she's just so raw in it, and that's kind of what I want to get to in my own graphic memoirs, to just allow myself to bear that truth that's so hard to admit.
Yeah, I was thinking too, like modern people that still encouraged me, like Lucy Knisley is incredible. I started reading like her travelogues when she was doing French Milk, and Natalie Noriga, who did, I moved to Los Angeles to work in animation, but she also used to do travelogue comics, which I think was Home is Anywhere Where the Internet Is. And those were like on Tumblr, but those were similarly people who was like, well, I loved Kate Beaton and Jess Fink's like shorter form comics. They were doing something that was like a much longer dedicated thing, and that was inspiring in a different way. So yeah.
And Cena Grace. Not my bag. It's funny to like. Nothing lasts forever. Just seeing somebody and kind of like in comics, trying to make it in comics, but also fumbling in what you don't see. You know, you see us right now with these books, but you didn't see us like working at movie theaters and having failed relationships and crying on Tumblr and.
Oh, you can see me crying on Tumblr.
I know.
It's still there.
So I think Cena Grace is not my bag. I think it's a great one.
Shannon Hale, she's an author of comics and prose, and one of the things that she said was that books and comics can teach empathy to people who read them. And so I think one of the important things about memoir comics is you're reading something that you might have no experience with, but I think in every memoir comic you can relate to some experience, and it gives you an understanding for that person who's reading them. And I think that's definitely something that is throughout all of your works, is that although each is about something very different, the idea that you can see yourself in that is very important. didn't really have a question with that. I was just thinking it as you guys were talking, because I think memoir comics are so important because of what they bring to everybody else. Maybe you can see yourself as a superhero, and obviously some of you guys write superhero books as well. But when you see yourself in a memoir comic, and you're talking about the eating disorder, and I had that experience too, where like we told a friend's mom she had an eating disorder, and her mom was like, "No," and it's like, okay. And when you see those comics, then you make you feel a lot less alone, and I think that's something, that's really, really important. And I really applaud you for doing that work and putting yourself out there in a way that makes you vulnerable, but that shares something with everybody else.
Can I say
Oh
one?
yeah,
Sorry.
I'll stop talking.
To that point, another one, because I have such, it's hard to be like, which autobio comics do you like? And it's just so many. But in terms of them having like a very real world difference, Ellen Forney's book Marbles, which is just like, if you haven't read it, and please read that book. It's so good, especially if you've struggled with any kind of mental health or have someone in your life who has. It's a book where she talks about her diagnosis and her struggle to get properly medicated for bipolar disorder, and that was the thing that finally pushed me to get over my fear of medication. I have all the brain problems, anxiety, depression, stuff like that. And for my whole life, I was like, I want to be better than medication. I'm weak if I need it. I just need to suffer. And then I read that book, and then like read it again when I was really going through that process. And I was like, the thing I loved about it so much was that she wasn't like, here's how I got my diagnosis, and then here's how I got medicated, and everything's better now. It was like, I tried this medicine, and it had these horrible side effects. I tried this medicine, and I had this honeymoon period, and then it didn't work with this. And so it was so reassuring, because especially as I had to try a bunch of different medications to find the right combination, it was like, that was the thing that kept me going. So yeah, I really do believe these things can have like a huge impact, even though it's like you never know who it's going to reach. You never know, but sometimes it does. So yeah.
Did you write her?
No, I tweeted at her once. I was really embarrassed because I loved that, and I loved her book Lust, all the illustrations from The Stranger that she did of the personals.
Oh, you should write her.
I just like tweeted her once, and I was like, I love your work. Your book saved my life. Anyway, bye.
Did you find that people feel like they really know? Like, it's funny because we've never met before, but I was like, oh, I saw you post that shirt on Instagram. Like, do you feel like people think they know you really well now because they've read the book? Does it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, especially because I'm a person who's on social media all of the time, and I have a little bit more of a distance than I used to, but I used to just be like, everything is out there. I'm 21. I don't know what consequences are. And it still is a thing where people come up to me at conventions. Like, I went to a con once, and I had done a fundraiser because my cat had needed surgery, and so many people came up to me at the con, and they were like, oh, how's Lilu doing? And I was like, I don't know who you are. This is so strange, but I did put it out there. But it is a thing, and I sort of had to try and draw a boundary for a while, because especially because I do a lot of comics about sexuality, I got a lot of people trying to make me their unicorn for a while at cons. Like, couples would come up and kind of proposition me because they were like, you're bisexual and open about it. And I was like, not for you. I'm 22. Please go away. So I did have to kind of like draw a line there. But yeah, that totally happens. I'm sure it happens for some of you guys too, where people like, yeah, they do feel like they know you.
Does anyone else have that experience?
Yeah, this one guy mailed me his driver's license because that was the only picture he had. I still have it. Actually, I'm going to sell it.
Do you want to open it up for audience questions? I don't know what time it is, if we have time for that. Yeah. Okay, anybody got any questions?
So, have you gotten feedback from the books, and where they said you changed my life, or you helped me, or anything like that?
I've had that happen a little bit.
I mean, I think that I've had a lot of people, especially to this short comic, because it was published on the internet, so it had a really wide reach. I was just so surprised how many people reached out, and they're like, that was my experience with Arabic, that was my experience with Russian. Yeah, we just had this conversation, and it's like, although my experience is so specific, other people were still able to project themselves and see themselves in this experience and be like, oh my God, like that like explains so much about like why I have this troubled relationship. So I think that, yeah, like a lot of people have reached out and told me that it was very affecting, and then they saw themselves in it, even though their experience is radically different than my own.
Yeah, I've definitely had it happen a bunch of times. Every year at FlameCon is kind of like the best thing in the world and also the most emotionally draining experience of my year because I really started and still do make a lot of comics about sexuality. Like I'm bi, I'm non-binary, and that was a thing I only really, like the non-binary thing is a thing I only really came out about very recently. But I talk about sobriety, I talk about sexuality, I talk about all this mental health stuff, and at normal conventions, people are like, oh, I like Hellcat. I like your other sort of fictional books. And at FlameCon, which is a gay Comic-Con, it's like a line of people being like, you helped me come out. You helped me realize I needed to think about my drinking. You helped me my favorite story that like very quickly that ever happened was a guy who came up to me at my first TCAF and was like, your comic helped me come out to my brother who I had like an extremely estranged, distant relationship with. And when I came out to him, he came out back to me. And now we're like best friends and we're super close and like their parents had passed away. And I was just like crying. And he's like, you've done so much for me. And I'm like, you've done so much for me. It's a lot, but it's so amazing when that happens.
Oh, well, I hate to sound flippant, but my comics were a good way to meet musicians and really famous ones. So, the guy from Soul Asylum worships me.
That rules.
Yeah, you take
Yeah, you can.
Hard act to follow.
Yeah, you
huh?
can. You're so okay. That's so cool. I shouldn't say anything, but I did a library event in North Hollywood, and a Native American family that was Bosco Yaqui. It took in like an hour and a half bus to come to my event, and she wanted her kids to see something like this because they hated who they are. And I wanted to cry, and I signed their books, and they just immediately left. Like, they didn't give me, like, I wish I had more time with them, but yeah, it's a lot of the times you're doing stuff for people that, it comes back in a beautiful way.
I mean, I think for me, it's like so many of the people that I crossed paths with when I was growing up, who are in pop culture now. I think it's sort of like a nice trip down memory lane for a lot of people, like who read the book. So they're like, "Oh my God!" Like, you do the guys in the state, like who now are like, big, huge, famous movie stars and film directors and stuff. And it's like, yeah, when I was 17, like, just interacting with these people and like a lot of like sort of slices of New York that just don't exist anymore, like CBGBs or, all these like sort of bars that were in particular places. But what I love is that, like, it's not just the memoir stuff where people, like, come and relate to you. I mean, I'm sure you have this with Wonder Woman or with, with your superhero comics that, like, I have people who come up to me about Shade the Changing Girl and, like, they're like, this is the book that describes me. And, like, for me as a creator, that's the thing that's so great is you never know how, because I put a lot of truth into, what I'm doing, like I was saying before, that like it's just always so amazing when you get an an email or a letter like that. I just got a letter yesterday about the Plain Janes, and this girl who wrote me, and she was like, I'm so glad this came out again because I read this when I was 13 because it came out 13 years ago. And she was like, and this is the reason why I went to art school is because of this book. And it's like, that's the kind of stuff that's really amazing, that art can touch so many people.
Jackie?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
I did a panel with her once, and by the end of it, I was like, "You're so cool."
Yeah, she is. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
This is for Victoria. Several years ago, there was an artist on the internet who took a very normal-looking woman and then morphed this person into what each culture around the world.
Oh, I saw that.
You've seen that.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you remember how they morphed the
like
prepubescent by
yeah.
American standards.
And also like really emaciated, like so thin, terrifyingly thin actually. And yeah, that is definitely like part of the cultural aspects of, coming to America and this really deep-seated fat phobia that is very specific to the Asian culture. So yeah, like I think that seeing that, and I was like, that's a perfect illustration to kind of show like culturally what they think is the ideal is even more extreme than what we have here.
Right. And so how could any Chinese American woman who still has roots there
Yeah.
thinking that way feel normal in America where, for one thing, we have food. Herbs are accepted.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a difficult transition, especially because like we live so much in this in-between stage of being both culturally Chinese and also American, and we want to embrace like that movement. Like for me, learning about body positivity and health at every size, like that was something so foreign to me because I never saw anybody like that, and the idea that that could even be a thing was very, very hard for me to accept at the beginning. But I'm still working towards that, and definitely something that I'm very passionate about is body positivity. But because coming from my background, it made it a lot harder than I think than it would have been if I'd been just American.
Any other questions? Vince?
Personally, I have memories of being an awkward teenager and being a super poser and have anxiety attacks over it at night sometimes when it comes to me. And I think it's super brave of you guys to put your memoirs out there. And so my question is, are you able to revisit your work? Because you always have to talk about it, and I'm sure you rely on your memories of creating it. But are you able to revisit it, and get reacquainted with what you put out there? Or is it kind of like you put it out there and it's done, and it's out in the world, and you just kind of rely on what you remember from your creative process to talk about like you do right now?
I like what Victoria said before when you talked about, that was then and it's, not now. I always think of a book that I did. It's never finished, right? It's like you could always fix it some more. But it's just a document of where you were at that time. So when I look back at it, even if I cringe and I'm like, oh my God, I write so much better now or whatever, I just think of it as like, well, that's where I was then. And now I've grown, or now I've changed, or now I see that differently. And so this is where I am now.
Yeah, my book has turned into it's like a kid that I had and it's gone to college now and it doesn't call back anymore. It sends checks like randomly because it knows I need some money, and it's just it's like not a part of me anymore, and it's for everyone else to hate or like enough to, buy it.
It's kind of like recording a CD. Once again, back to music. You get, try to get it done as fast as you can. I like to do things in one take, and because I think about everything in my brain for years before I draw it. And like some old music, sometimes you listen to it, it sounds, wow, that's pretty good. And then sometimes it's like, ooh, that was out of tune. But you just have to take a risk, and just do it and take a risk.
Yeah, I think for me, like revisiting some of those memories while writing it was incredibly painful and very hard. But I do think that like your relationship to your book is while you're working on it, and then once it's out in the world, it's kind of not yours anymore. Now it belongs to your readers. So for me, like I don't go back and like read my work necessarily, but I do kind of hold on to those memories of having made the thing. Like that's the important part.
I don't like to look at anything I made more than like 2 weeks ago at any given time, but I'm also insanely hard on myself. It is really funny, the comics that I did, because when I started on Tumblr, the comics I made were called Kate or Die. Everyone thought my name was Kate Ordy, but it was a pun. But those were like, I drew myself in them and it was me and very clearly. And then like I went through some pretty traumatic stuff and I stopped writing about them because I couldn't write about what was happening for a number of different reasons, and then sort of left that behind. Didn't do autobiographical comics for the long time. And then the thing that finally stuck was, when I could draw like people as animals and make it like funny and not really, and I had that much distance between it. But looking back on that stuff, there's a lot of like, ooh, but also I think 4 years ago, it was really hard to look back at the stuff I'd done 3 years before. But now that it's been so long, I can look back and be like, oh, you needed therapy so bad, you sweetheart. So it's not quite as terrible as it was. It's much more just like, that sure is a 22-year-old.
I think on that note, our time is up, but I just want to thank you all for coming. And if everyone wants to, once again, say their name and what they want, if they want to plug anything, where they can get your people, what your book is, or.
I'm Henry Barajas. You can find me on the street.
And your book?
My book is Voz De M.A.Y.O, Tata Rambo. It's at your library. And thanks for coming.
My name is Cecil Castellucci. My book is Girl on Film, and you can get it at your library or your bookstores, hopefully.
Mary Fleener. You can get my latest Billy the Bee from Fantagraphics or Amazon.
I'm Kate Leth. You can find me anywhere on the internet at Kate Leth. My webcomic, which is the big thing I'm doing right now, is it's on Twitter, it's on Webtoon and things like that. It's just valleyghouls.com. And that's what I'm doing now.
I'm Victoria Ying. My mother tongue is, you can find it on the Nib. Currently, Diana Princess of the Amazons in stores everywhere. And July 2020, City of Secrets. Also, internet at Victoria Ying, pretty much everywhere.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
Laura.
I know what you mean about Canada. I lived there 7 years when I was a kid in Vancouver.
Oh yeah, I grew up in Nova Scotia.